When war broke out in 1939, Alexis Preller volunteered for service. He knew he could never bring himself to kill, so he joined the medical corps and was sent to the Western Desert.
The wounded were brought in at the end of the day in a long convoy that would come in just at nightfall. And from about 6 o'clock in the evening, right through the night until 6 o'clock the next morning, we had to handle these men. One of the first things I remember was a young boy came in. He happened to have been too close to a burst of shrapnel, and all of the shrapnel had lodged into his back. Now, this boy is stripped naked under the hospital light. It's in a tiny tent, and probably the tent is being concussed by the wind all the time. His whole back is painted brown with iodine. Little swabs of gauze are placed into each shrapnel wound, and by the time they're finished under the light, this boy becomes incredibly poetic because it was as if a group of butterflies had settled onto his back. From my point of view, it was something quite valid. This was material for me to take observation, you see. Now, having used that boy several years later, where I did a nude lying on her face, I called it Fleur de Mal. Already even a war theme, a thing like a wounded man, can be made use of later on, you see.
In June 1942, he was taken prisoner of war. Liberated in Italy, he was repatriated through Egypt and the east coast of Africa, home to his family. He came from a conservative background. Olivia Maria Preller, his mother, and his sister Minnie. Alexis was closer to Minnie than to his rugby-playing brothers. He was the baby of the family. Alexis as a young boy. Minnie kept a family album that shows a maturing young man. In the circle of close friends, P.O.W, taken at Ygdrasil, Preller's studio on the outskirts of Pretoria. When he came back from the war, he found Minnie, whose husband had gone up north, was expecting a child.
Well, I was married to Pat Murphy when he was sent overseas, and I was expecting Tim's. And Alexis stood by me all the time, and then when the cable came to say my husband was missing, the doctor said that if Minnie knew about this, she wouldn't have her baby. And so for 5 weeks, Alexis never left my side, and yet I never suspected anything. If the phone rang, he was there first. People were phoning, and he bribed the postman to keep all the letters aside for him, and he would steam them open. If he thought it was all right, he'd let me have them. And Tim should have been born at Christmas time, but he was only born on New Year's Day. And the morning when I phoned Alexis and I said, I think you'd better come now, he says, have you made up your mind? And he broke the news to me when Terence was 10 days old.
My first impression of him, the thing that I can remember most of all, was that if I had a problem with decorating something, if I had now built a model or designed something, then Alexis was always somebody that I could go to. And he always had the time to stop with whatever he was doing and help me. He was definitely a father image to me, yes. Through a number of stages, I should imagine. In the early stages, he was very definitely essentially a confidant and a friend to me. In later years, he was somebody that had an intense amount of self-confidence and belief in himself, but at the same time was never that stage-ish that you couldn't approach him. He was always the sort of person you could talk to.
An immensely approachable, immensely courteous man. He had a very interesting characteristic. When Alexis Preller spoke to you, there was no one else in the room.
I would say that he was a person of great gentleness.
Alexis had this almost a phobia about not under any circumstances hurting anything, whether it was an insect or whatever the case may be. And the farm being in the early stages without electricity, it was essentially candlelit. He had a great love for candles because of the soft lighting effect that it gave, and also because of the almost statuesque sort of forms that were created by the molten wax. Of course, the candles were placed on the floor because Alexis lived that way. No chairs in his house. And, of course, the moths came after the candles in the evenings, and the frogs came after the moths. And as nature would have it, the snakes came after the frogs. Now, to him, a snake was part of creation, was part of life, and it was never to be disturbed, and certainly not to be killed. So that if a snake was found on the property, and there were many in the early days of the farm, a box was obtained and the snake was encouraged into the box. The box was closed up, put on a wheelbarrow, taken over the road and put on the neighbour's farm. I think the neighbour must have had quite a surfeit of snakes by the time I had been out there a couple of years, but this was him, this was Alexis.
You know, no one ever went out to the farm uninvited or without advising him in advance because he was so totally involved in his work. But when one did go out, the warmth of reception was tremendous. One was greeted not only by Alexis himself, but there were maybe 14 cats and a pride of peacocks, all of whom rushed forward. And there was this lovely feeling of being welcomed into a special territory. And it was a special territory. It had a kind of magic about it.
His farm, Dombeya, is his final resting place. Near Hartbeespoort, it overlooks the Nikolits, and here he made his home and the buildings around it. Tobie, Louw, an architect.
Alexis was an absolute natural architect. He started off with buying that plot on account of these very fine Dombeya and marula trees. He discovered this little spot, which is just immediately to the south of his living room, and his house was built around that.
Dombeya never stopped growing. Over the years, he added to the buildings, and his final great project was the Modif.
I thought that by drawing the line on the floor, and I stand right back from it, I can actually see what we're doing, whereas the string doesn't indicate enough. The whole point about the mealie mill is that it goes right back to Alexander the Great. When Alexander was founding his city, he saw a soldier walking with a pack of meal on his back. There was a hole in the pack, and Alexander went up to him and tore the hole bigger and said, "Walk." And the mealie mill left the line across the city where he wanted an avenue.
This structure was to be a memorial to his friend and patron, Norman Eaton, who left him the Arabic doors which inspired the design. In the last few years of his life, Alexis began to collect his own earlier works, and he had hoped to hang the pictures in the Modif, but death came before the memorial was complete.
His residence, the little cottage in which he lived, was extremely austere, hardly any furniture in this one large main room.
Alexis was basically an extremely simple nature. And he always strived after simplicity.
His studio was his theatre, and Alexis had a great sense of the theatrical. Whenever I went out there was always new work to show me, but it wasn't a question of just wandering into the studio casually and looking at it. He would dash away. One would have to wait under the trees outside the cottage until he was ready, and then he would summon his guests into the studio, and then he would say, either close your eyes, don't look just yet, or now. And he would turn a painting around with great showmanship, and there you were confronted with the latest example of his vision.
Come on, let's go.
Because he had planned not just his days, but his hours. If he had unexpected people rolled up unexpectedly, they did get not just necessarily a frosty welcome, but in some cases they were in fact thrown off the property.
If Alexis was working, if he was busy...
Edward Bernardi.
If he was preparing for an exhibition, and even his dearest and most closest friend would phone him, he would say, "I'm working. I don't want to see anybody." Alexis was a professional to his fingertips.
As he was a perfectionist in his life, he liked everything on the perfect way. So we discussed sometimes framing for hours, asking my wife, myself, himself, and took sometimes hours until we came to the final conclusion.